There were no screams, no battles, no enemy marching over the horizon. Only an ordinary morning, as the city woke the way it had for generations. Wooden doors opened, market stalls were set up, children ran through narrow streets, their laughter echoing between old stone walls. No one knew that, in that exact moment, something was already moving toward them. Something without swords, without banners, carrying a silent verdict on life and death. At first, it arrived gently. A fever that lingered longer than expected. A body weakened for no clear reason. Then, strange marks appeared on the skin, small enough to be ignored. People called it bad air, a seasonal illness, a punishment from forces they could not name. But the signs spread faster than rumor ever could. Doors closed, familiar faces vanished from the streets. The city began to learn how to fall silent. Then the truth revealed itself in the cruelest way. Not one household, not one neighborhood, but entire communities, collapsing layer by layer. Physicians stood helpless before bodies marked by suffering they could not explain. Ancient remedies failed, prayers multiplied, but lives did not return. For the first time, humanity was forced to face a chilling reality. Its knowledge was no longer enough to protect itself. What was it that killed millions across centuries, from ancient civilizations to the crowded cities of early modern Europe? How could a disease with no intent and no consciousness force humanity to rethink the body, illness, and the responsibility to preserve life? And how did this near total helplessness give birth to an idea that would change medicine forever: vaccination? To understand that, we must return to the beginning of one of the deadliest diseases in human history: smallpox. Long before anyone called it smallpox, the disease was already leaving its signature on human history. Not as a single dramatic first outbreak, but as a slow, almost inevitable consequence of the way people began to live closer together. When humans shifted from scattered communities to denser settlements, they also created a new kind of environment for pathogens. A virus that requires close contact does not thrive in isolation. It thrives in crowds, in households where several generations share a room, in marketplaces where strangers press shoulder to shoulder, and in cities where movement never truly stops. The exact birthplace of smallpox is still debated by historians and scientists, but many traces point toward the ancient world, where early urban life and long-distance exchange were already reshaping society. Some researchers have argued that signs consistent with smallpox appear in ancient Egyptian mummies, suggesting the disease, or something very close to it, circulated thousands of years ago. Whether or not those specific cases can be proven beyond doubt, the broader pattern is clearer. Once large populations became stable and interconnected, smallpox gained what it needed most: a steady supply of new hosts. Smallpox is caused by a virus that spreads primarily through close human contact, often through respiratory droplets and contaminated materials like clothing and bedding. That detail matters because it links the disease directly to everyday life. It did not need armies to be deadly, though armies would later amplify it. It did not need famine to appear, though famine would make it worse. It needed people living together, trading together, worshipping together, caring for the sick together, and burying the dead together. The same social bonds that built civilizations also became the channels through which the virus endured. Trade routes became invisible bridges for infection. Merchants carried goods across deserts and seas, but they also carried viruses in their lungs, on their skin, and in the fabrics they touched. Ports and caravan cities, built as nodes of commerce, became nodes of transmission. Warfare played its role as well, not because smallpox was a weapon in the ancient imagination, but because war concentrates bodies under stress, Soldiers marched, camped, shared water, shared blankets, and returned home, sometimes bringing the disease into places that had never encountered it before. Hygiene and sanitation, as we understand them today, did not exist. Crowded streets, limited access to clean water, and the habit of caring for the ill at home meant exposure was often unavoidable. And because smallpox can confer long-lasting immunity in survivors, the disease behaved in a particular rhythm. It struck hardest in populations with many children, because children were the ones who had not yet been exposed. In places where the virus became endemic, it could become a grim feature of life, returning again and again, shaping demographics, family structures, and even the face of entire societies. This is how smallpox begins, not with a single moment, but with a historical transformation. The rise of cities, the expansion of trade, the movement of armies, and the intimate architecture of human life. In building the ancient world, humanity unknowingly built a home for one of its most relentless killers. Once smallpox had established itself within human populations, its spread followed the logic of movement. The virus did not travel on its own. It followed people, their routines, and the systems they built to connect distant places. Every road, river, and sea lane that carried goods and ideas also carried infection. What made smallpox especially devastating was not only how easily it spread, but how silently it moved before its full effects were visible. Transmission occurred most efficiently through close contact, breathing the same air in enclosed spaces, sharing clothing, bedding, or household objects, and caring for the sick all became pathways for the virus. In crowded cities, where families lived in tight quarters and daily life unfolded in shared spaces, isolation was nearly impossible. By the time the characteristic rashes appeared, many others had already been exposed. The disease often outran human awareness. Trade intensified this process. Merchant networks linked continents long before modern transportation existed. Caravan routes across Asia, maritime trade in the Mediterranean, and later transoceanic voyages all extended the reach of smallpox. When traders arrived in unfamiliar cities, they brought wealth and opportunity, but also vulnerability. Local populations, especially those who had not previously encountered the virus, faced outbreaks of exceptional severity. The disease did not need to be introduced many times. A single arrival could ignite a chain reaction. Migration added another layer. People moved in response to opportunity, conflict, and environmental pressure. Entire communities relocated, sometimes fleeing famine or war, sometimes drawn by economic promise. These movements blurred the boundaries between regions that had once been epidemiologically separate. Smallpox exploited these transitions. A traveler who appeared healthy on departure could become contagious days later, carrying the virus across borders that no authority could effectively close. Urban centers amplified every surge. Cities functioned as reservoirs of infection. High population density ensured a constant supply of susceptible individuals, particularly children. When conditions aligned, seasonal changes, increased travel, or social gatherings, outbreaks flared with renewed intensity. These were not isolated events, but recurring waves that reshaped life over generations. Communities learned to expect the return of the disease, even if they could not predict its timing. The initial human response was shaped by uncertainty. Without an understanding of viruses or immunity, people searched for meaning within familiar frameworks. Some blamed contaminated air, others divine punishment or astrological alignments. Cities imposed quarantines with limited effectiveness, closing gates or restricting movement after the disease had already spread. Households marked their doors, signaling sickness within, not as a strategy of control, but as a warning born of fear. Despite these efforts, surges continued. Each outbreak reinforced a grim pattern. The more connected a society became, the more vulnerable it was to rapid transmission. Prosperity and disease advanced together, bound by the same networks. Over time, smallpox ceased to be perceived as an anomaly. It became an expected catastrophe, a force that periodically reasserted itself whenever human mobility and density reached a critical threshold. In this way, the spread of smallpox revealed an uncomfortable truth. The very mechanisms that allowed civilizations to grow and interact also ensured that the disease could not be confined. It was not simply a medical crisis. It was a structural consequence of how the world had begun to function. The true weight of smallpox is measured not only in numbers, but in absence, in empty homes, in interrupted family lines, in faces that never reached adulthood. Over centuries, the disease claimed an estimated hundreds of millions of lives worldwide, making it one of the deadliest forces in human history. In many societies, few families escaped its reach. Death became so frequent that it lost its shock, even as its impact deepened. Smallpox struck hardest among children. In endemic regions, it was often considered an inevitable trial of early life. Those who survived carried lifelong immunity, but also visible scars that marked them socially and physically. Survivors bore pitted skin, damaged eyesight, and in some cases permanent disability. These marks became common enough to shape standards of beauty, marriage prospects, and social identity. The disease did not simply kill. It altered how people were seen and how they saw themselves. Families lived with constant uncertainty. Parents knew that each outbreak could take their children, yet had little power to prevent it. Birth rates were shaped by this reality. In some regions, high fertility functioned as a response to high mortality. Communities adapted emotionally as well as demographically, developing rituals of mourning that reflected the expectation of loss. Grief became structured, almost institutional, because it was unavoidable. Cities felt the impact in waves. During severe outbreaks, commerce slowed or stopped entirely. Workshops closed as workers fell ill. Markets thinned. Skilled labor disappeared, sometimes permanently. In agrarian regions, outbreaks during planting or harvest seasons led to food shortages months later, extending the damage beyond the disease itself. Smallpox was not only a health crisis, it was an economic shock that rippled through time. Entire societies were reshaped by repeated loss. In regions newly exposed to smallpox, particularly among populations with no prior immunity, the consequences were catastrophic. Mortality rates soared, social structures collapsed, and cultural continuity was broken. Knowledge passed orally from one generation to the next was lost when elders died in large numbers. Political systems weakened as leaders and administrators succumbed alongside common people. Yet even in places where the disease was familiar, its presence distorted daily life. People planned marriages, travel, and communal events around the fear of outbreaks. Childhood was shadowed by the knowledge that survival was uncertain. Death was woven into the rhythm of life, not as an extraordinary event, but as a recurring expectation. This was the human cost of smallpox. Not a single apocalypse, but a long erosion of stability and continuity. A disease that did not end societies outright, but slowly reshaped them by removing millions of lives, altering bodies, and forcing generations to grow up in a world where survival itself was never guaranteed. Faced with a disease they could not explain, people turned to the tools they had. Belief, tradition, observation, and hope became the foundations of treatment. Long before smallpox was understood as a viral infection, It was interpreted through cultural and spiritual frameworks. Illness was rarely seen as random. It carried meaning, and meaning demanded response. In many societies, smallpox was associated with divine will or supernatural forces. Some cultures personified the disease as a deity or spirit that could be appeased. Rituals, offerings, and prayers were performed not to cure the sick, but to persuade the illness to spare others. These practices were not expressions of ignorance alone. They were attempts to regain agency in a situation where human control seemed impossible. When medicine failed, belief filled the void. Traditional medical systems approached smallpox through balance rather than eradication. Physicians observed patterns: fever, eruptions, weakness, and recovery. Treatments focused on guiding the body through the illness rather than stopping it outright. Herbal remedies were used to cool fevers or ease pain. Diets were adjusted. Patients were kept warm or cool, depending on prevailing theories. Some practices helped alleviate suffering, others caused harm. Bloodletting, purging, and the application of irritants sometimes weakened patients further, reducing their chances of survival. Care itself carried risk. Family members and healers remained close to the sick, touching them, feeding them, cleaning their bedding. In doing so, they often became infected themselves. There was little concept of protective distance. Compassion and duty outweighed caution. Entire households fell ill in succession, not because of negligence, but because care could not be separated from exposure. Over time, careful observation led to subtle shifts. Some healers noticed that those who survived smallpox did not contract it again. This pattern was not immediately understood, but it was remembered. In parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, this knowledge gave rise to practices later known as variolation. Material from smallpox sores was deliberately introduced into healthy individuals in controlled ways. The intention was not to eliminate risk, but to reduce it. The procedure was dangerous, but in a world where smallpox itself was far more deadly, it offered a calculated gamble. Variolation was not universally accepted. Many feared it as an invitation to disaster. Others saw it as interference with divine will. Yet it spread slowly, carried by practitioners, traders, and travelers who had witnessed its effects. It represented a profound shift in thinking. Disease was no longer only something to endure or appease. It was something that could be managed, even anticipated. Behind these practices stood countless unnamed individuals. Healers who experimented without formal knowledge. Caregivers who stayed with the dying. Communities that isolated the sick when they could, even at great emotional cost. Their efforts were imperfect, often tragic, but they laid the groundwork for a new relationship between humans and disease. Stage 4 of the smallpox story is not a tale of medical triumph. It is a record of persistence, of people reaching beyond fear, using observation and courage to navigate an invisible threat. In their attempts to treat smallpox, humanity began, slowly and unintentionally, to imagine a future where disease might be prevented, not just survived. The turning point in the history of smallpox did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It emerged gradually through accumulated observation, quiet experimentation, and a growing willingness to question long-held assumptions. For centuries, people had noticed patterns without fully understanding them. Survivors of smallpox rarely fell ill again. Communities that endured repeated outbreaks began to recognize immunity, even if they lacked the language to describe it. What changed in this stage was not the disease itself, but the way humans interpreted these patterns. By the early modern period, variolation had spread beyond its places of origin. It traveled with physicians, merchants, and diplomats, moving from Asia and the Middle East into Europe. The practice was controversial, but its logic was compelling. If deliberate exposure could produce a milder illness and lasting protection, then suffering might be reduced rather than merely endured. This idea challenged deeply rooted beliefs about fate and divine will. Disease was no longer only an external punishment, it became something that could be anticipated and, to some extent, shaped by human action. The true shift came when observation replaced imitation. Instead of using material from active smallpox infections, some practitioners began to notice that exposure to related but less dangerous conditions could also provide protection. This insight marked a fundamental change. Protection no longer required risking the full force of the disease. It suggested that the body could be trained to resist illness without being destroyed by it. This moment reshaped medical thinking. The body was no longer viewed solely as a fragile vessel at the mercy of external forces. It became an active participant in its own defense. Immunity was not a mystery granted by survival alone. It was a biological response that could be guided. This realization did not end smallpox overnight, but it weakened the disease's grip on the future. Equally important was the social transformation that followed. Communities began to accept preventative measures as a shared responsibility. Protection extended beyond the individual. Decisions about health now affected entire populations. This shift laid the groundwork for public health, introducing the idea that preventing disease could be more powerful than treating it after the fact. Smallpox began to lose something it had always relied on: predictability. As immunity spread deliberately rather than accidentally, outbreaks became less devastating. The disease no longer dictated the rhythm of life with the same certainty. It was still present. It still killed. But its dominance was no longer absolute. Stage 5 marks the moment humanity stepped out of pure reaction and into intention, not through triumph, but through understanding. It was the point where centuries of suffering were transformed into knowledge and where fear began, slowly, to give way to strategy. When smallpox finally loosened its grip on the world, the change was not marked by celebration. There were no clear endings for those who had already lived through its centuries of presence. What remained was a quieter transformation, a world that looked familiar on the surface, yet carried deep structural scars beneath it. Populations had been reshaped, family lines had been broken and rebuilt. Faces still bore the marks of survival, visible reminders of a disease that had once decided who lived long enough to grow old. Childhood was no longer viewed as a simple passage of time, but as a period of profound vulnerability. Death, once accepted as frequent and unavoidable, began to feel less inevitable. Something fundamental had shifted. Humanity no longer saw mass disease as a permanent condition of existence. The idea that entire generations could be lost without resistance no longer felt acceptable. The legacy of smallpox extended far beyond medicine. It changed how cities were organized, encouraging new ideas about sanitation, isolation, and collective responsibility. Laws and customs evolved around quarantine, inoculation, and public health obligations. Medical thinking moved away from pure tradition and authority toward observation, evidence, and prevention. Perhaps most importantly, the relationship between individuals and society was redefined. Health was no longer only a private matter. It became a shared concern, where personal choices could affect entire communities. The concept of preventing illness before it appeared reshaped hospitals, governments, and scientific institutions. From smallpox emerged the foundation of modern immunology, and the belief that knowledge, applied carefully, could protect future generations. Today, smallpox exists only in memory and in controlled laboratories. It is the first human disease to be eradicated, not by chance, but by intention. Yet, its story is not one of triumph alone. It is a reminder of how long humanity lived at the mercy of forces it could not understand, and how slowly understanding was earned. As we face new diseases and new uncertainties, the legacy of smallpox invites reflection rather than fear. It asks us to remember that progress is fragile, that prevention is a choice, and that the lessons paid for in millions of lives carry a responsibility. History does not end with eradication. It lingers quietly in the decisions we make next.